Good morning. We're coming to you today from the offices of Aird & Burles, and we are going to be speaking to you about the Canadian real estate industry, both residential, commercial, things that are on our minds. We have some interesting topics. We have 5 presenters this morning, 2 from the industry experts, and 3 from our offices of Aird & Burles. We're going to be speaking to you on a number of things, and the time is going to go very quickly because we've each got about 10 minutes, and we're going to leave Q&A to the end, and as much time as we have, we will give you for questions, so you can send them in, and we will do our best to answer them. I should also tell you that we have 609 registrants for this morning's presentation, and we're thrilled to welcome you all. We have representation in our registrants from Belgium, Bermuda, of course Canada, Central African Republic, Israel, and USA. So welcome to all of you. I also want to tell you that the links to the PowerPoint presentation will be on our website at the end. And you can, if you miss anything, because we are going to go pretty quickly, you can always go back and have a look at it there. So without further ado, I'm going to start. My name is Tammy Evans. I am a land development lawyer at Aird & Burles, and my clients are primarily developers. And I'm going to speak to you today about what's on my mind with respect to the residential market, both residential sales and residential real estate. I'm going to talk just very quickly. I'm just going to remind us all, Canada is the world's 11th largest economy. We know this already. Real estate drives 1/5 of our economy. Toronto is the leader in terms of real estate investment in Canada, with Vancouver coming up second. And one of the things that I always pay attention to is population growth. We have a significant population growth projected over the next 24 years. We're looking at, by the year 2041, probably about 18.5 million people. And in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, for those that are outside our local area, that represents a 40% population increase to about 9.7 million by 2041. Now, of course, immigration, we have solid immigration policies in Canada, and those immigration policies account for about 76% of the population growth. So, with those baselines, I want to talk to you about, from my perspective, what's affecting the Ontario residential sales market. So generally, we've got the Bank of Canada benchmark interest rate increase, which has now been moved to 1.75%. This is the 5th increase since summer of 2017, and it is now the highest rate since 2008. For those of you that have been in the industry as long as I have, I saw problems in the late 80s, late 90s, and we are now seeing nothing but a little bit of growth and some slowdown. This is nothing like what we saw in those, I'm not going to say recession times, I'm going to say in those major slowdown times. So I think it's not a time to panic, but again, that's my opinion, and I don't have a crystal ball. But what happens when the interest rates go up from the Bank of Canada? What happens is the top banks follow. So the top 5 banks have now raised their prime rates, that's their lending rates, to 3.95%. That's a significant impact, of course, on the consumers. From the regulatory side, we have a couple of things happening. We have, in the market now, we have the new mortgage stress test for consumers. This stress test is intended to address the high debt ratio to disposable income. So what does that mean for the average consumer, the average purchaser? It means that they now have to qualify at their bank's 5-year lending rate plus 2% generally on a 25-year amortization. That means, for an example, I've given you an example here of an individual will have to earn $140,000 a year to afford an $800,000 home with a 20% down payment. This is generally on a 3%, approximately 3% interest rate on a 25-year amortization. And that's with no significant other debts. Now, we know that, and I'll come to this later on in my presentation, but we know that the under 44 age bracket is the highest carrying debt in Canada for the age bracket. So the next thing that we have that is impacting is the investor tax, and one of our next presenters will speak a little bit more on the impact of the investor tax. But I do want to mention it here because this came in late 2017, and it caused a little bit of stress in the market because offshore investors are now taxed an additional 15% on top of the land transfer tax, and if you're in Toronto, you have also municipal land transfer tax. So this is an additional 15% tax on non-resident investors in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area, which is an impact directly on the pocket. The last thing that I put on here, because this is something, because I act for developers, is something that is always on my mind for my clients. The Canada Revenue Agency has implemented a program to audit all condominium development projects. And what this is doing is it is making people nervous. So it's making developers nervous. It's making lawyers nervous, and it's making investors in particular nervous because they're looking at HST rebates and HST rebate eligibility. So they're tightening up the requirements for HST rebate eligibility, and of course the developer is not going to want to take on that risk, so the developer is going to be tightening its own protocols in its own shop and in its sales shop on the same. So what's the effect of all of these things happening, both regulatory and marketplace and economic indicators? We have less affordability. We have a slight increase in sales prices again. We still have a steady rise of sales. We're not in a deficit at this point in terms of sales. But the price of sales is really impacting the market. So the average sale in GTA right now is $782,000. In Toronto proper, it's $824,000. These are primarily driven by the condo market because the condo market is still over 54% of the market. For an average detached home, though, in the Greater Toronto Area, the average price is $907,000, and for Toronto proper, it's greater than $1.3 million. This is high. Think again about the under 44 age category. National home sales are not as good because BC and Alberta are having a slightly negative effect on it. And new listings are up slightly, but sales are down. Another impact here is the current home inventory. Right now we're sitting at a little over 5 months nationally, entering fall and winter 2018. So the year-to-date supply is down approximately 40%. This is very important. The next slide will tell you another impact. The next point gives you another impact in the market that really is going to have a material impact for developments coming into 2019, 2020, 2021. We have condominium project starts and cancellation stats here. To give you an idea, for 2018, we had approximately 119,400 units started, so launched in the GTA. But cancellations, project cancellations, resulted in approximately 5,100 units being canceled in the market. Remember that I talked to you about the immigration policies and the anticipated population growth. We have a projected over 300,000 new immigrants coming in annually. 17% of those are coming into Toronto. Where are we going to put them? We also have condominium reform, and we'll talk about this very, very quickly because we have condominium reform already in place, but we also have more to come. And these are just a couple of points of what's to come. This is going to impact buyers in the market because costs are going to increase for buyers in the market. We have an increase in hard costs. Land is at an all-time premium. Construction costs are through the roof. And pre-development costs, we'll talk about some of those in more detail, I think, in our next presentation. But pre-development costs are astronomical right now for land. So what does this mean? If you had a budget for construction that you put into place for your lending ability 4 years ago, 3 years ago, if you're not in the ground today, you're going to have a hard time getting in the ground and making any money out of the project. So you have to review those numbers. Lenders are tightening up their lending policies, they're syndicating, and they've got an intense, deep due diligence that they might not have been doing before. Okay, popping over into the rental market very quickly. Purpose-built rental construction is up, but of course rents in new construction, even new rental construction, are higher. So total units are up over 27% since 2018, but it's still insufficient to accommodate the market. Remember that we have a renter's market here more than we have an owner's market. The average rent increase year over year in the GTA is by about 10%. So for example, a 740 square foot unit is about $2,200 a month. In Toronto proper, it's about $2,400 a month. That's an 8.4% increase on per square foot. We also have vacancy rates in the rental market hovering at still less than 1% in 2018. Remember, this is purpose-built rental. The cost gap, the own versus rent gap, is still high, which you can either say it sustains the rental market or it increases the rental market, whatever you prefer. I talked to you about the under 44 age group. That's the highest percentage of renters. This is according to Stats Canada, and they also carry the most debt. Less than 45% of 25 to 34-year-olds actually own, versus in 2006 we had about 55%. So, my summary: sales are slowing down, yes. There's less product in the market. Developments are being canceled. Lands are switching hands. There are some developers going bankrupt. We have to watch what's going on in the market. Lenders are moving to more syndicated lending. They're spreading the risk out even further. They're tightening up their due diligence requirements. Investors are nervous, but we'll get over that with that investor tax. That intended investor tax will not have the impact, in my view, that it was intended to have to slow down investors investing in the market. We have more rentals, we have less sales, and again, I've talked about tightening the bankruptcies and deeper due diligence by the lenders. And the last point I'm going to put here: when we have these effects in the market, everybody's watching. So the surety companies are watching, the ones that put up the bonds, the marketing bonds to Tarion, the ones that lend to you. And Tarion itself is being pressured to look at what's going on in the market. So we're going to have some increased attention that may not be good for development. That's my presentation. I'm going to pass you over now to Julie DiLorenzo, who's going to speak to you from a developer's perspective.
Good morning. I wanted to tell you that I've actually been around for one recession more than Tammy has, when in 1982 interest rates hit 18%. Some background that will be useful to you, those of you who wouldn't have even been born then. The recessions and economic setbacks before 2008 all lasted many years. And since 1995, there hasn't been a major realignment of how we do business. So the question is why? The Toronto market has continued to rise and be strong. We have a strong established immigrant community who are now a pipeline to new buyers. We've come a long way opening up new markets. In the worst part of the 1989 recession, brilliant Eve Lewis and a few of us went to Hong Kong to see if there was a market for Toronto product. There was not. They were selling Australian product. We now are known in many countries as a great place to invest. We are constantly profiled in important media as a top city for all the reasons we know: safety, great schools, good health care, great quality of life, and the ability to do business. We as an industry had a good and strong dialogue with policymakers, and they listened because we were respected as an important part of the economy. So what happened? Then in a short period of time, we have been inundated with policy changes, new laws, taxes and regulations, such that we may be at a tipping point or a slowdown, or it's already here and no one has their ear to the ground. We know already that volume is down. Some say as much as 50%. We already had a housing affordability issue while we were producing record volumes. Or did we? Did we have a problem at all, and the media and governments confuse resale hype as a problem across the board? That is the genesis of the problem, in my opinion. Resale markets make no construction jobs and pay no DCs, whereas new construction is one of the largest employers and economic contributors. Prior to the slew of changes and regulations that started around 2015, we were just at the point where we were producing enough volume that rents were stabilizing and softening. We had pockets of time where launches of projects in exceptional locations like Yonge and Eglinton and Yonge and Sheppard were selling without frenzy, in fact with deep incentives to attract clients, at a normal pace and at competitive prices. Then, because we have little proactive dialogue with policymakers anymore, we all got too busy doing our jobs. A slew of changes and regulations from various governments came to pass all at once, meant to slow down a market that was being seen by government and media only through the lens of low-rise resale market that was frothy. Why did government impose a foreign buyer's tax on new housing supply when even CMHC had written that foreign-owned investor condos helped alleviate the rental housing problem? We needed those sales to get product off the ground to meet pre-sale targets. They also require higher deposits, which strengthen pro formas. Every measure that government implemented from then meant, in my analysis, to slow down the resale market, directly affected the creation of new supply in some way or another. So we find ourselves now, in my opinion, at a tipping point. As a positive, constructive person, like most of my peers in the industry, I believe we can fix this. But it needs unprecedented discipline and a complete overhaul of how we are perceived, and we must, like we did in times before, work to educate our policymakers on our contribution as an industry, both to innovation, affordability, housing supply, economic development, and stability. This must be done before the slowdown snowballs. We can expect regulation coming over project cancellations. Let's get in front of it. We can expect changes to LPAT system, since it isn't known yet necessarily that approvals have slowed down substantially because of it. Let's contribute to what that solution looks like. We cannot allow development charges that are implemented after sales start and unknown at time of sales. I can't help but think that part of the reason the market has lasted as long as it has is because we had to work on fundamentals of policy as an industry coming out of deep recessions. We were the first to be invited to the decision-making table, and now we are the last to be substantively consulted. A case in point about policymakers working without substantive input of our industry is a well-intentioned initiative about family housing in condominium form caused there to be a recommendation on size of family unit. The very industry that creates housing was not at the table until after the recommendations were published. Kudos to staff for finally calling us in. We can work together to meet your goals if we are at the table. How many affordable housing panels, discussions have you seen where anyone includes the housing market providers? Very few. Government and policymakers should know better than to exclude the very engine of housing supply from material decision making. We have some tidying up to do ourselves and should do it proactively. People in the industry need to advocate again. I recently told my kids that there's never been more reason to advocate, and yet there's never been more apathy or issues exhaustion. I saw a beautiful group of young, smart leaders from business at a recent City Hall meeting about family housing, and again last night at an event honoring Blake Hutchison. It's time for the new young developers and housing professionals and advocates to proactively think of initiatives where we can contribute to policy before policy smothers us. When the market slows down and government coffers empty, they come back to us anyway, so may as well be in front of the issues and avoid being choked by policy. Some ideas. Proactively initiate discussions with the provincial government about the possibilities of reinstating a body where the provincial policy on housing supply is enforced. Bolster our associations and create a cabinet from various associations tasked to improve our image by showing how much we contribute to the economy and that we should be the first player in the discussions on how to deliver housing. Initiate new rules of play where our industry demonstrates discipline, like maybe not being able to sell product until you even have planning approval. Get to know your customers again. People forget that it wasn't uncommon to sell directly to clients with presentation centers where people came back on many visits before they made a commitment. Those clients are there. In Australia, new immigrants must buy new product. Brilliant. And maybe the foreign buyer tax should be refunded if a unit is rented for 1 year from occupancy. That way we get back the sales we needed to meet our targets. We had a healthy combination of buyers inclusive of foreign buyers. Revisit the stress test possibly. We know banks know that homeowner loans are one of the most stable loan prototypes. They are people that are qualified when they bought and aren't qualifying at closing, not because of their credibility or financial capacity. That doesn't seem reasonable. Contribute to streamlining analysis for project permits. Insist, even if through new legislation, that policies do not apply to projects that sold. No retroactive taxes. The number one most affordable and effective solution, maybe not affordable, but the one most effective solution to affordability is public transit. We must advocate for public transit. In an era that requires a deeper understanding of the issues, even with international resources, a collaborative effort between the providers and the policymakers, and substantially more advocacy on our part, more than in cycles past, is required. We can't say we're too busy, or we won't be busy at all. Thank you. I now turn the speaker to Patricia Foran.
Thank you, Julie and Tammy. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about something that Julie just mentioned, and that is the LPAT, otherwise known as the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal. Many developers and landowners and the public are familiar with the former Ontario Municipal Board, or OMB. That body is now continued under a new name, and it is called the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, or LPAT. Like the OMB, LPAT will continue to hear appeals for land development matters under the Planning Act. They do have different powers than the previous OMB, which we're all starting to become familiar with. In terms of the LPAT powers, there are sort of three sources that people need to be aware of. One is obviously the Planning Act. We continue to have one in Ontario. Our land development decisions continue to be made under that Act. However, the ability to appeal matters to LPAT from municipal council decisions has changed in many cases under the Planning Act. Additionally, and perhaps having been given a little less focus, is the LPAT Act itself, or the legislation that gave rise to LPAT, has changed the powers of that tribunal when compared to the old OMB. So the LPAT body is different in terms of its powers, and its procedures are significantly changed than what we had 6 months ago under the OMB. The LPAT itself, like the former OMB, has put out rules that will govern how its hearings will proceed. Most appeals that people are familiar with in terms of zonings and subdivisions and official plans will fall under what's referred to as the Part 2 rules. What most people, and many people, are not aware of, and some may say cynically is a boon for lawyers, is that there's now a potential for 2 appeals under the Planning Act in front of LPAT, whereas in the former Planning Act 6 months ago, you really had the opportunity only for 1. So developers certainly should be aware for that potential. There is an initial hearing on the appeal that comes before LPAT. In general terms, if the appeal is not dismissed, then the matter is sent back to municipal council for a second decision. There is a time frame associated with council's decision making for the second go round, and then that can be appealed a second time back to LPAT all over again, and you get to have a second hearing. So did I mention that it's a boon for development lawyers? Of some note to landowners and developers, and something that's most people did not cotton on to 6 months ago when the legislation changed, is that landowners and developers under the new Planning Act and LPAT Act are not automatically parties to the appeals that may be dealing with their development approvals that they got from municipal council. So, for example, if you secured an approval for a project, let's say in the City of Toronto, and it was appealed by another landowner or a residents group, you as the developer and applicant are not automatically a party to that hearing. And you are, like all other members of the public, required to make an application to be added as a party. And so far we've seen some parties being, some landowners being added, but it is not automatic, and the process does not include you automatically before you get to what's called the first case management conference. So for many landowners, you need to be aware of that, because you are in many ways shut out of the appeal process on your own lands and with respect to your own development approvals. Secondly, what most people are not quite aware of is that, in fact, the appeals proceed largely by way of written records. And LPAT has the option to require an oral or written hearing, so it's very different in terms of the process that took place under the old OMB framework. So the hearings themselves and the process has become very paper heavy, even in the first 6 months. And it has become, there have been a number of issues raised with respect to what LPAT can do by way of asking for expert evidence and cross-examination in the traditional hearing process. There is a stated case that LPAT has made to the Divisional Court asking for some direction on its hearing procedures. That decision was just made last week, so we don't know yet when that will be heard or what further direction will come from the courts with respect to how hearings can unfold under the LPAT Act and the new Planning Act. In terms of, again, for developers, for pro formas and prognosticating as to how do you get from point A to point B, there is some differences in terms of the first appeal period. So when matters can be appealed automatically from a lack of decision, there are some extended periods of time under the Planning Act. More significantly, from my perspective, if you are running, again, sort of trying to get an idea of time frames for decision making, you need to always factor in the potential for a second appeal. Because you now, in the past, we were always asked to sort of give an estimate of time to get through a first hearing. Now you have to also factor in the fact that there may be a second hearing on a decision that you get from LPAT. There are regulations with respect to LPAT's decision-making time frame for those matters when they have control over them. And so you now see by way of regulation that for matters of first appeals, for official plans, official plan amendments and the like, LPAT is required by regulation to complete its process within 10 to 12 months. And then factoring in the possibility of a second appeal, you then have further 6 months for resolving second appeals and another 6 months for another appeal back to the tribunal for a second hearing. So the question, I think, has been raised by many people as to whether at the end of the day this is going to be a more efficient, cost-effective, or fast process. Did I mention that it's a boon for development lawyers? For those people who are listening in, the LPAT has published on its website 2 appeal guides, A and B. There are 2 sets of appeals that go to the tribunal. As I mentioned before, many of them are called Part 2 appeals. You still also have matters, for example, with minor variances and consents, and those are dealt with differently, very similar to the old OMB process, and those are dealt with under Part 1. So they, for example, will have a 6-month time frame for decision making. So 6 months into this, my initial observations are the new process is extremely paper heavy. The LPAT is inundated with, and I'm not overstating it, pounds and pounds of paper with respect to the requirement for appeal records and parties to actually put in writing as opposed to orally their cases right up front in the first 40 to 50 days of an appeal reaching LPAT. So from that perspective, I don't think for landowners and developers it's any less expensive so far. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, you have to factor in the potential for 2 hearings in place of 1 under the old process. We're not seeing any less appeals going to LPAT itself. While LPAT exercises a screening of appeals once they come before them, there are very few appeals that have been dismissed as not valid initially by LPAT. So most appeals are getting through the initial screening and continuing then into the hearing process. We've had only a few case management conferences under the new rules and the new process that have taken place in the last month, and we've had no hearings yet in front of LPAT to test the new rules. So by way of summary, it's still very early days for the new LPAT process and the appeals, and we're still feeling our way through the process itself. Obviously, we're interested to see what kind of direction we get from the divisional court in terms of how hearings can take place. I would conclude by saying I think it's premature to make any determination that this is a more efficient, cost-effective, and better process to deal with approvals or to deal with appeals that come before LPAT. I expect that the government may, in fact, consider making some changes to some of the process that we're seeing unfold so far. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cecilia Williams, who's going to talk about the tech boom.
Thanks, Patricia. Good morning, everyone. I'll be talking about the tech industry and its impact on commercial real estate in Toronto. My approach is as follows. What I've done is I've taken 6 sets of statistics from a CBRE report that was published earlier this year called 2018 Scoring Tech Talent, which is a great report for any of you that want to get into some more of the guts of what I'll be talking to. And I'm going to start with just a very general stat on the tech industry in Canada and the United States, and that is the measure of the number of tech talent workers as a percentage of the workforce. So you can see on the first slide it's 5 million in the US, which is about 3.5% of the entire workforce there. And in Canada, it's 834,000 tech workers, which represents over 5% of the employment workforce. And this relatively small workforce has an outsized impact on real estate markets and the economy. Almost a third of the tech workers in Canada are in Toronto, and they represent almost 9% of the workforce. So if you look at Canada, it's at just over 5. In Toronto, they represent almost 9% of the workforce. And I'll walk through why this is important in the next few slides. In 2017, there were 29,000 tech jobs created in Toronto, up 14% from the year before. This is more tech jobs than were created if you add up the San Francisco Bay Area, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. That's a pretty powerful stat. In downtown Toronto, the tech industry accounts for more than 30% of the demand for office space. And Toronto has added the most tech jobs over the last 5 years of all of the 50 cities that were part of this study by CBRE. What this study did is it took a measure of tech talent, and it's a broad measure of competitiveness. It looks at talent supply, talent concentration, education, the cost, the outlook for jobs, and rent growth for offices and apartments. And the report ranks the largest 50 cities in the US and Canada in terms of tech talent professionals on their ability to not only attract, but to grow tech talent. In 2016, Toronto was ranked number 6 overall, and it jumped up 2 spots in 2017 to be number 4, and you can see it's behind the Bay Area, Seattle, and Washington. The competitive advantages that Canadian cities, particularly Toronto, but also Montreal, Ottawa, and Vancouver, which are also mentioned in the report, include high quality and well-educated tech talent, cost efficiencies, which are supported by relative currency strength between the Canadian and the US dollar, as well as a more open environment to immigration in Canada versus the US, particularly in recent years. In short, we have high-quality talent at a more cost-effective price point. In Toronto specifically, we also have a high rate of millennial population change within the large tech talent markets. And millennials in this study are defined as being between 20 to 29 years of age. The U.S. average was an increase of 3.7% of millennial population change between 2011 to 2016. Toronto was in 8th place at 7.2%, which is almost double the average in the U.S. Now, why does this matter? Why is the presence of and the growth of the millennial population important? The younger part of this generation has been raised in an internet-connected environment, and they expect their working environments to continue advancing technologically. Millennials also, in general, prefer to live in urban environments, which have resulted in many downtown neighborhoods coming back to life, not just from a residential perspective, but also because tech talent companies want to be close to the talent. The commercial demand has risen accordingly. Making up the largest demographic, the number of millennials entering the workforce is the driving force to the growth of tech talent across all of the 50 markets measured. Moving on to cost. The greatest cost for companies within tech talent markets is wages. I don't think anyone would be surprised by that. The next highest cost is office rent, also not surprising. Tech talent companies put a high value on what's called tech clustering, meaning that they want to be close to the institutions of higher learning that have high levels of investment in innovation and that generate high-quality talent pools. There is also tech clustering that takes place around companies that attract other companies, such as startups, to an area, supporting innovation in that manner. Some of these tech companies can also be very specific about where they want to be in a particular city, down to potentially the exact street. And these tech clusters drive the tech companies that make them up to collaborate and also compete with each other, pushing the innovation process further. I know for us at Allied, we've had this experience in Kitchener, which would be part of the Toronto statistics in this study. And we've had 2 developments already built for Google specifically because they wanted to be close to the University of Waterloo, which is considered to be Canada's MIT. And with Google wanting to locate in Waterloo, there are other companies that service Google that also want to be close to there. So there's a tech hub that has been growing in Kitchener, and that would be a great example of the tech clustering I just spoke about. So considering these 2 buckets of costs, wages and office rent, this slide shows the relative annual costs for a company of 500 employees requiring 75,000 square feet of office space. You can see that Toronto is just over half the cost of the Bay Area. So the Bay Area being the most expensive market overall of the 50 cities at over $57 million a year. Toronto being just a little over half of that at $30 million. And Montreal is even less than half of what it costs in the Bay Area at 27.6% and the least expensive market overall. It's actually less expensive than Ottawa in the study. The growth in the tech industry has pushed labor and occupancy costs up, even in Montreal, which is the most cost-effective one, as I just mentioned. There, the costs were up 13%. And this is really what has been driving commercial vacancy levels down as well. In Toronto, we're at 2.8%. That's a record not just for Toronto, but that's the lowest vacancy of any city in North America today. And there are no signs of this softening within 24 months. The reason I say that is that right now demand is ahead of supply. In 24 months, roughly, we expect supply to start to meet demand, at which point we should see a plateau or more of a balance between demand and supply. When I speak to leasing brokers in Toronto, they tell me that they've never seen a market like the one we're experiencing right now in Toronto, and these are brokers that have been in the business for multiple decades. People ask me after we have conversations about this, what's the risk scenario? And it really comes down to responsible development. And what we're seeing is that developers are launching projects with pre-leasing commitments. And so everyone seems to be developing responsibly and have learned their lessons from the 90s. Developers are also operating at much lower levels of debt than they were in previous decades. The next slide shows brain gain, which is a calculation that is done in this study of the tech degree, the number of tech degree graduates versus tech talent job creation. And Toronto came in number 1. There were also brain drains in the study, which were actually Boston and Washington, meaning that they created less jobs than the number of graduates. So Toronto specifically had a net gain of 55,000, and that equated to 82,000 jobs being added between 2012 and 2017, when only 27,000 tech degrees were earned in that same period. San Francisco was in second place at a net gain of 47,000 versus Toronto's 55. In the top 10 rankings of brain gain, Canada actually had 3 of its cities, Toronto in first, Vancouver in 6th, and Montreal in 10th. And what does this mean? Basically, our cities are great at attracting tech talent. Canada itself is not on the map in terms of real estate, but our cities are. People often refer to the Canadian Quartet, being Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. Unfortunately, I didn't see Calgary in the study at all. Ottawa was in the study, but a lot of people that I speak to are still hopeful that Calgary will be able to somehow reinvent itself, similar to the way that Denver did, into more of a tech city. Now on to my final slide, which is tech labor concentration, which I touched on in my first slide, but just to recap. This is the forward-looking metric, and I'm going back to tech labor concentration. I mentioned that Canada was at 5.3%. In Toronto, we're at almost 9% of the total employment is in tech labor. You can see Ottawa is at just over 11%, and the Bay Area is at almost 10%. What is tech labor concentration? Like I mentioned, it's the percent of total employment that is considered to be in tech. And it's an important metric not only in reflecting the health of the tech market itself, but also, and more importantly, its growth potential. So if you think about the last slide, where Toronto was ranked #1 in brain gains, we really want to keep this momentum going. And the tech clustering, the like is attracting the like. So the more tech labor concentration that a city has, the more it will continue to attract, because the tech labor will want to be close to other tech labor. So the ongoing potential of the market is important. It's this concentration of highly skilled, highly educated workers that creates and maintains the drive for innovation. And more tech jobs means more economic growth. And a healthy tech sector is thought to be a potential mitigator to an economic downturn. What we're seeing is the positive impact of the tech sector on fundamentals, which is driving the strength of commercial real estate in Toronto today. And with that, I'll pass it on to Sherry.
Thank you, Cecilia. This is Sherry Altschuler, and I'm a partner in the Capital Markets Group at Airden Burles. And what I'd like to talk about today is some recent developments from the introduction of different policy changes from our securities regulators, and with a particular focus on the real estate sector. Before I jump into that, I would like to encourage people to submit questions if they have not done so already. We've received a number of questions come in already, but if you'd still like to, we welcome that. There's going to be three main topics of focus. There have been other announcements throughout the year, but these are the ones that I think are likely the most relevant to the audience that we have here today. The first is financial reporting disclosure and an increased focus that we're seeing on reporting related to non-GAAP financial measures. The second is related to disclosure and potential changes regarding women on boards and in executive and management positions. And the final one ties to some of the comments that we've heard earlier today relating to changes to syndicated or potential changes to the requirements for syndicated mortgages. Over the past several years, in fact, we've seen an increased focus on non-GAAP financial measures and the disclosures related to those measures by the Canadian Securities Administrators. For those of you who are not located in Canada, each province has its own securities commission, and together, each commission comes together and tries to form harmonized sets of rules with national application through the CSA. Not all of the policies have national effect, but they do try to harmonize where possible. Up until now, the guidance that is out there related to non-GAAP financial measures is only that. It's only guidance, and it does not have the force of law. But they are recommendations for disclosure related to non-GAAP measures. What we see is, in response to certain concerns that have been raised, proposed legislation that has come out to mandate specific disclosure related to non-GAAP measures. And from the CSA's review of the real estate sector, they've found a lack of transparency when adjustments are being made to financial statements using non-GAAP measures, and they're questioning the appropriateness of these standards generally. They have indicated that this is in response to concerns raised by both investors, but also from broker communities who are trying to compare these metrics and various other market participants. So there's this assessment going on of the quality and sufficiency of the disclosure, and the regulators are sending a very strong signal that they would like better disclosure. I've included a quote here specific to the real estate sector, and it says, and I'll read it for the group, It's real estate issuers need to be transparent about the various adjustments made in arriving at non-GAAP financial measures such as AFFO, particularly maintenance, capital requirements, and working capital. They should also provide appropriate disclosures when they are distributing more cash than they are generating from their operations, including the sources of cash used to fund the excess. Industry groups, as we know, have tried to come up with some standardized interpretations of these non-GAAP measures. For example, in February, RealPAC came up with a white paper to try and come up with standardized measures for AFFO and FFO. These, of course, are subject to interpretation and adjustments by the companies that are applying them, but there is an attempt by various industry groups to come up with comparable measures. The next slide, which is being used with the permission of the OSC, really just breaks down what we mean by GAAP and non-GAAP measures. So GAAP measures at a very basic level are those that are derived from your financial statements, including your notes. And one example is net income. Non-GAAP measures are the measures that are used in your other reporting documents, including your MD&A. And I mentioned one just on the prior slide, which is AFFO and FFO, which are frequently used in the real estate sector. This slide, and it may be hard to read on your screen, so I encourage you to zoom in, sets out staff's expectations when you're using non-GAAP financial measures. And there are 7 areas of guidance that they have given. You're supposed to state expressly that the non-GAAP financial measure does not have a standardized meaning. You're supposed to name it in a way that distinguishes it from disclosure items specified, defined, or determined under the GAAP that you're using, in a way that's not misleading. You're supposed to explain why the non-GAAP financial measure provides meaningful and useful information. You're supposed to present it with equal or greater prominence to that of non-GAAP. Present with equal or greater prominence to that of non-GAAP measure the most directly comparable GAAP measure. So you're supposed to compare it to your GAAP measure. You're supposed to provide clear and quantitative reconciliation of your non-GAAP measures to the most comparable GAAP measure. Ensure that the non-GAAP financial measure does not describe adjustments as non-reoccurring, infrequent, or unusual when a similar loss or gain is reasonably likely to occur within the next 2 years or occurred during the prior 2 years. And finally, you're supposed to present the non-GAAP financial measures on a very consistent basis. As I mentioned at the onset, this guidance has been out there for a number of years, and the regulators are not satisfied with what they're seeing in public disclosures. In an effort to improve the disclosures surrounding non-GAAP financial measures and certain other financial measures, the CSA is intending to replace these staff notice guidances with legislation that is called National Instrument 52112, Non-GAAP and Other Financial Measures Disclosure. And there's going to be a proposed companion policy that provides some explanatory around that national instrument. As a national instrument, it will have the force of law. And it was published in draft form on September 6th. It's out for comment now. The comment period expires on December 5th. And we encourage you, if you have any comments, to submit your comments to the regulators on the proposals that are being suggested. At a very high level, it sets out disclosure requirements for non-GAAP financial measures and other financial measures, for example, segment measures, capital management measures, and supplementary financial measures. Each is defined in 52112. The application of these measures are going to be both to the issuer, the company providing the disclosure, and is required for each disclosure document. So it's not sufficient to only have these disclosures in, for example, your MD&A. You must have these disclosures in each time when you make a communication in electronic form about these measures. And that's very specific. It's only in electronic form. There has been some commentary about whether this would cover, for example, social media communications. And the regulators have indicated that you're not required to put fulsome disclosure on a social media communication. However, if you're going back to one of the primary communication documents, then they will require some more fulsome disclosure. Even though at the end of this list they do say social media, in discussions they are looking at that one in particular. Here's the breakdown of the definitions. And so, as I mentioned on the prior slide, they're looking at non-GAAP financial measures and other financial measures. And there's some examples on this slide on what those could be. There's a very, it looks complex, but it's their thought matrix. And this is the thought matrix on the next slide that, again, unfortunately translates to a very small slide on this. But in the interest of time, I'll just give this to you because I do think that it breaks down how you would navigate which bucket of a non-GAAP financial measure versus a segment measure your company may fall within and how it would be related to disclosure. And again, just in the interest of time, I'll go quicker. The next slide breaks down what you're required to do if these new rules are enacted in terms of what disclosures you're required to do. Very quickly, the CSA also came out with a report on women on boards and in executive office positions, and they're seeing improvement, but it's still slow improvement. 55 real estate issuers were included in this sample, and there's some statistics on the next few slides, but what I'll skip ahead to are these slides. Of course, when I was preparing them late yesterday evening, my arrow was overly optimistic and pointed to retail. What you'll see for the real estate sector in the data is that the percentage for issuers in the real estate sector with one or more women on boards jumped 9% from 64% in year one to 73% in year four, which is a big improvement. It's still only a representation of having one woman on the board, but it's still an improvement. The next is women with one, for real estate industry participants with at least one woman in executive officer positions. And real estate had one of the highest percentage of issuers with one or more women in executive officer positions, which jumped 10% from 65% in year one to 75% in year four. The CSA, those were some improvements, but the CSA is still not satisfied with the improvements that have been made, and as a result, they are looking at a number of steps, including particular mandates, requiring targets, requiring policies, board renewal policies, and whether women are being considered for these opportunities at all. The CSA will continue to be looking at this over the next year and may be introducing more stricter requirements as we've seen in other jurisdictions around the world. Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, I wanted to comment about syndicated mortgages because I think that's relevant to a lot of the individuals listening in today. As was mentioned at the beginning by Tammy, and there's been a very big, significant increase in the offering of syndicated mortgages in connection with real estate developments in certain jurisdictions. And as currently stands, there is an exemption from the prospectus requirements in certain jurisdictions where you have securities that are mortgages if they are sold through a mortgage broker licensed in a Canadian jurisdiction where the property is located. That exemption does not apply in Alberta, BC, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec, but it does apply here in Ontario. As a result of the significant increase and concerns that this area is not being regulated sufficiently, there was a new framework that was proposed and by the Canadian Securities Administrators that, if it comes into force, would change the rules regarding syndicated mortgages. The comment period ended on June 6th for these changes, and they're being reviewed by the CSA with an intent to publish amendments. But at a very, very high level, it would require enhanced disclosure in your offering memorandum documents. It would remove the availability of a private issuer exemption for companies that have been raising using that exemption, you would be required to use accredited investor exemption, friends, family, business associate exemption, or the OM exemption with these higher disclosure requirements. And in particular, they are looking at requiring the delivery of a current property appraisal prepared by an independent professional appraiser to investors who are purchasing syndicated mortgage investments under the OM exemption. With that, I am going to, I think we may have time for one or two questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Trish. The first question is, has anyone gone through the LPAT test and won an appeal?
Thanks, Sherry. No, we're very early days with respect to the new appeal tests, which were set out in the Planning Act effective April 3rd. So there have not yet been hearings with respect to that. My expectation is that we have seen, because we have seen many appeals that are involving that new test get through the validity screening process that LPAT has, that we really do have to wait and see what happens at the first written or oral hearing, which will take place probably in the next 6 to 8 months. So that's the short answer, no, not yet.
Thank you. The next one I'll give over to Julie, and it's, will Toronto's infrastructure keep up with the current pace of development?
I think it's a fundamental question to look at in various ways. The industry has paid probably billions of dollars of development charges over the years, but they weren't earmarked. So we're aware that some of those development charges didn't necessarily go to keep up the infrastructure or to improve the infrastructure for the new housing. So we paid for infrastructure that maybe necessarily has not been improved. Therefore, the burden of that infrastructure will be on future projects, which increases the cost of new delivery. The solution to keeping up with the infrastructure is to earmark development charges specific to projects the way they do in many constituencies so that there's accountability. The answer is we can. We're backlogged, but we need to earmark the monies that we pay so that we know what projects the monies are going to.
Thank you. Trish, we have a number of other questions here on LPAT. I don't know if there's any that you want to in particular tackle.
Sure, I'm happy to. There was a couple of questions that were related to what I had referred to in my presentation about LPAT having stated a case to the divisional court. The LPAT has the power to ask the court to give them some guidance with respect to their procedure. They have, in the past, the OMB has exercised that similar power. LPAT did that last week. I don't know when the divisional court will be able to hear the matter and give some guidance as to how hearings will unfold. One of the questions that we've had was, first of all, what was the name of the case? So I can answer that. It's sort of referred to as the Toronto Rail Deck case, and I'd be happy to send an email out with a link to that decision that came out from the tribunal last week to whoever's interested. It relates to another question that we got about restrictions on evidence, because that is one of the questions that the divisional court is being asked to actually give guidance on. We had expected that there would be restrictions on new evidence before the tribunal. The assumption was that council at the municipal level would be holding a hearing, and that their decision and any appeals related to their decision would only look at evidence that had been provided to council in the first case. We have not seen that unfold as yet. In fact, much of what's happening at LPAT right now is the exchange of what are called appeal records, and they first and foremost are required to have affidavits from experts who can provide opinion evidence. So we have not seen there being significant restrictions as yet on evidence before LPAT. However, the court is being asked to give some guidance on whether that's going a little too far or how we deal with that new evidence. So I can't tell you today what the answer is going to be. But if I get appointed to the divisional court in the next 6 months, I'll be able to help you.
Well, with only, I think, a minute to go, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank our panelists today, Cecilia Williams from Allied Properties, Julie DiLorenzo from DeMonte Urban Corp, Tammy Evans, my partner, who's in our real estate and development group, and Patricia Forum, who's in our municipal group. I think it's been a very good discussion today, very fast-paced, and I do encourage you on the slide you'll see the information for our next webinar, which is the New Construction Act: What You Need to Know, which is on Wednesday, November 14th at 9 a.m. Thank you for joining us.